one to the other. Section 5. Information Technology and Change Management. As we've already established, the end users are very important in implementing a new system. If they're not properly trained or properly motivated, the system is not going to work. So, in order to understand this, Torrington and Waitman look at 4 types of change and the reaction from members of staff. So, the change could be imposed from above. There is no debate, there is no discussion, likely to be met with considerable resistance. People will be questioning, why is this happening? Why should I do it? And many managers in this situation will turn around and say, because I said so. Well, that's not a very motivating way of treating your staff, and therefore likely to cause some problems. Another method is one of adaptation. This is where there have been changes to the environment that people are operating in, and as a result of this change there have been changes in attitudes, changes in behaviour. This is, if you like, life going on as it normally does. The problem with this is if it happens too much, it generates uncertainty. My manager used to say that it was really important to balance to the nearest penny when I was doing a reconciliation. Now they're saying it's okay to balance to the nearest pound. Well, people are slightly unsure about what the future holds. Is this going to continue to change? Another type of change is one caused by growth. This is where there are new opportunities out there that, generally speaking, are met with delight. Now, in the workplace, perhaps delight is a little bit optimistic, but certainly there's a very positive reaction, a positive recognition that the business is expanding, is growing, and is taking advantage of opportunities to everybody's benefit. And finally, change can come about through creativity. The idea that individuals can investigate and control the change process itself. This is, according to Torrington and Waitman, leads to excitement on behalf of the staff. There's a sense of ownership and control here, which is very motivating. We'll see some of that with the HR motivations later in the course. Reactions to proposed change can be broken down to 4 reactions. Firstly, acceptance. People accept that the change has got to happen. They might not like it, but they're not going to try and resist it. Secondly, indifference. A person might just simply see the change as irrelevant. Whether it goes through or not, the person argues, it doesn't make any difference to me. Passive resistance. The person dislikes the change and they want to resist it. However, they resist it not directly by complaining, but by presenting obstacles that delay or sometimes even stop the project. So, for example, you might get a member of staff coming to you and saying, look, I love the new system, I think it's really good, I think it's really important. The problem is we can't use it. And you say, why? Oh, well, because it takes too long. Because it's the wrong colour screen. Because every time I press the button it crashes. Now, these statements may or may not be true. The point is it's classic passive resistance. The person doesn't like the system and is simply trying to find excuses not to adopt it. Active resistance, on the other hand, the person comes straight out and says, I don't like the system, I don't think it works, I don't want to use it. As far as active resistance goes, a good practical example is the problem that British Airways had with its cabin crew. British Airways, of course, in a major protracted dispute with its cabin crew, classic active resistance there. There was a very clear statement from the staff, we do not think this change is acceptable, we are going to actively resist it by going on strike. Hunt expands on this sort of passive resistance by talking about behaviours that are aimed at resisting change. So pleas of ignorance. You've trained somebody how to use the system, and they still go back and use the old system. No, I don't understand it. I'm sorry. Don't understand the new one. And every time you train them, no, I still don't understand it. Delayed judgment. They'll put off the decisions for so long that everyone's actually forgotten about it. Maybe if I ignore it for long enough, it'll go away. Defensive stances. A whole list of things that, a whole list of reasons why this new system is not going to work. Display of various personal insecurities. The sort of thing we could see this, for example, is an excessive reaction against IT by somebody who is a technophobe. In a previous job, I was involved in implementing IT systems in an organisation that had never really used IT before. As a result of which, I had members of staff who were sort of perhaps in their 50s, who had never used computers before. Now, their reactions to this you could describe as a personal insecurity. There was a passionate aversion to anything IT related. It wasn't necessarily due to the fact that the IT was of a poor standard. It was simply because these people personally had a great terror of IT. And finally, withdrawal or disowning of the change. I watch Dragon's Den for many reasons. The main reason being because it's a very good illustration of how not to manage a business when you see these various contestants messing things up. But one of the things that you will see is the way in which people will try to disassociate themselves from change. So somebody proposes trying something, and everybody very carefully hedges their bets so that if it goes wrong, they can all leap away and say, I never supported it. Classic disowning and withdrawal. Section 6, dealing with user resistance. Having identified the ways in which people can resist change, we can now start to consider how these could be managed. Cotter and Schlesinger do what is effectively a spectrum. And this spectrum looks at the reactions that managers can have to dealing with resistance to change. And at one end of the spectrum we start off with education and communication. The logic here says that the manager and the worker share the same objectives, and therefore if there is resistance to change, it must be due to a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge of the new system, and therefore once everybody understands the new system, the resistance will disappear. As we slide down the spectrum, we move to participation and involvement, recognition that it's not perhaps quite as simple as just communicating, that perhaps people will feel more valued, people will feel part of the project if they are able to get involved with it. In other words, they have a sense of ownership. And by giving this sense of ownership, we'll get less resistance to the change. C starts to recognize that perhaps not everybody is going to be wonderfully better off as a result of this change. So facilitation and support helps those people who perhaps are feeling a little more insecure, a little more nervous, to make sure that they are properly looked after. So maybe, for example, extra training in IT for those who are unfamiliar with it. We're still coming at it from a point of view this change is for everybody's good, but that there are some people who are a bit more afraid of it than others. Now when we reach the section part D with negotiation, we now start to concede that with this change there are some people who are actually going to be worse off, as a result of which we have to find a best fit. We have to identify those people who are going to lose out and offer them some form of compensation to make up for what they're going to lose. Now as we slide further down the spectrum, this conflict, this difference, expands even more. So we then start to talk about manipulation and cooperation. We're talking here about spin. And in this situation, the manager will present a very biased version of the truth to get people to buy into a new system, on the understanding that if the manager had been more open and honest and objective, people probably wouldn't have been tempted to buy in. And finally, explicit and implicit coercion. There's no pretense here that there is any shared objective. Those adopting the change are simply pressured into accepting it, either explicitly, so accept it or you're fired, or implicitly through sort of emotional blackmail, personal pressure being exerted by a manager. Now, Cotter and Schlesinger is your main syllabus area here for dealing with user resistance. We've got a couple more models that are just worth mentioning very briefly. Lewin and Shine's force field analysis. The idea here is that Lewis and Shine say we are currently here. We want to get to our destination here. Now, there are some things that are pushing that forward, and we refer to those as driving forces. So driving forces encouraging the change. The problem is there are also restraining forces. And what Lewis and Shine say is to get from the current position to the destination, you do one of two things. You either increase the driving forces, and that will cause the position to change, or you get rid of the restraining forces. And if you like, based on the law of physics, you would then move. So that is Lewis and Shine. Lewin develops this stage a little bit further with a three-stage model: unfreeze, move, and refreeze. If we go back to this illustration, imagine that current position being a pole frozen in a block of ice. Now, in order to move that pole, the first thing I've got to do is to unfreeze the block of ice. Once I've unfrozen the ice, I can move that pole to its destination. The problem is, if I leave the pole where it is, it's just going to roll back. So in order to consolidate it, I'm going to refreeze it in its new position. So in reality, this is talking about perhaps unfreeze, break down old behaviours. Move, implement a new policy. Refreeze, encourage the new behaviours, perhaps with a bonus or reward structure. Well, having dealt with methods of managing resistance to change, we can look at it from another point of view and consider that actually it would be better if there wasn't any resistance in the first place. And the theory is that if a manager is suitably sensitive and proactive, it should minimize any resistance that's experienced. Sorts of things to consider then as a manager: the pace of change. How fast is this going to happen? Obviously, the faster things happen, the more likely people are to resist. The manner of the change. Is this change being coming about through discussion and debate, or is it simply being imposed from above? And of course you can refer back to section 5.2, Torrington and Waitman, to see how the manner of change can impact on acceptance. And finally, the scope of the change. How big a scope does this change have? Is it very small, in which case people aren't likely to worry, or is it going to go to the heart of the business? Other things that play an important role: commitment by all those involved. The more successful you want your change to be, the higher up you need this commitment to be. And coordination, everybody working towards the same goal. And communication, making sure that everybody understands they're all working towards the same goal. Daft comes up with several parameters. he says, what do we do? First of all, we identify the need for change. Why is this going to be delivered? We adopt the proposed change, this acceptance of the proposed change as a concept, making sure that resources are available. One of the biggest problems with projects is delivering on time, on cost. And of course, one of the difficulties is as soon as you start limiting the resources available, so it starts to make things much harder to implement. And of course, successful implementation is needed to resist or to prevent resistance to change, as we've already discussed in the earlier section. So what are the barriers? Why doesn't everybody do this? Well, cost is a big issue. It's very easy to minimize resistance to change if you've got unlimited time and unlimited money, but in the real world we don't have that. Maybe there's a failure to highlight benefits. People get so focused on the nuts and bolts as to what we're going to do, nobody actually starts to ask, why is it being delivered? Maybe if we explain to people that actually it's going to make their jobs easier, it's going to free up their time to do more interesting stuff, then that would help. A lack of coordination and cooperation. We've talked about the importance of both of those above. Uncertainty avoidance. Many human reactions is simply, I don't like uncertainty. I don't like the fear of the unknown. I prefer to stick with something that's not very pleasant rather than run the risk that the alternative could be even worse. And finally, fear of loss. The fear that it's all going to go horribly wrong links back, of course, into this uncertainty avoidance. Section 7. Post-implementation review and maintenance. The idea here is that once your system has been implemented, you want to check two things. The first thing is the system actually operating as expected? In other words, is it doing what we thought it was going to do? And secondly, a slightly different question, are we meeting the user's needs? Now, in theory, if we've done our PADI, our Systems Development Planning, Analysis, Design, Development and Implementation properly, the two should be one and the same. We should have a system that was designed to meet user needs. But we need to make sure that they are both being met. If not, there's probably more work to be done. Now, how can we review the progress with this? Well, first of all, timing-wise, it should be done relatively soon after the implementation and periodically on an ongoing basis. What can you do? Well, first and foremost, a cost benefit. The great thing about a cost benefit is it uses actual data, so you can see the actual costs, the financial costs, weighed up against the financial benefits. Now, one of the challenges here, though, is to take into account the different types of cost. Direct benefits, things that can be directly linked back to the project. Indirect benefits, not always directly measured. This may include things like staff motivation, improved productivity through that motivation. It's an indirect benefit. It can't be directly measured, but it has had a benefit. We need to offset those benefits against the development costs as well as the implementation and the running costs. Now, one of the problems with a cost-benefit review like this is that this data can, of course, be widely manipulated. You might have heard of a phrase called Hollywood accounting. This isn't on the syllabus, but it's a nice illustration of how cost-benefit and analysis can go awry. You may be aware that a lot of people in the Hollywood film industry get paid a percentage of profits for a film. So you might be given a relatively small fee and then a percentage of profits. Hollywood accounting refers to the fact that in accounting terms it's very, very rare for a film to actually make a profit. In reality, if the film is getting very close to making money, the producers will soon find some extra expenses to allocate to it in such a way that it never actually enters profit. That's one of the problems then with these sorts of reviews. Performance reviews, on the other hand, rather than just a simple cost-benefit, we can look at growth rates in file sizes, storage capacities here. We can look at staff requirements. Is it doing what the staff wanted? It can look at potential delays in processing and measure those. How many times does the system crash, for example? Is it secure? Does it keep the right people out? What are the error rates like? If the system isn't reliable and easy to use, then you can have all sorts of problems with inputting the data. Is the output from the computer actually being used? Certainly I've seen organizations that generate huge volumes of reports that are never actually looked at by anyone. It's only when you remove the reports and nobody complains that you realize that nobody's been looking at it. And of course your ongoing running costs. Well, there are three factors that contribute to the need for maintenance, the most obvious one being an error in the system. It's not doing what it's supposed to do, we need to repair it. This is compounded by poor documentation, where people start making changes to the system without documenting it properly. That causes even more of a mess. And thirdly, maybe the system is working perfectly, but actually our requirements have changed. And of course, in the modern business environment, as we've seen already, change is one of the constants, and therefore we need to continue to develop our systems. Now, there are three types of maintenance that we can examine. The first is corrective maintenance. So the system is broken, it doesn't work properly, it needs to be repaired. Adaptive maintenance, slightly different here. In this situation, the system is technically working as it was designed, but it needs to be updated or developed in some simple way to take account of minor changes. So the example here is maybe there's a change in the VAT rate, as a result of which the system isn't going to change itself. All we need to do is update it to make sure that we're now charging the right percentage of VAT. The main emphasis with the adaptive change is that it's a very small scale amendment that does not change the substance of the system itself. That change to the substance is what we refer to as a perfective improvement or perfective maintenance. In this situation, we are actually changing the system. We're adding a level of functionality that wasn't previously there. Section 8, outsourcing. Now this obviously links back to the end of chapter 1 where we talked about offshoring and outsourcing. Brief reminder though of your technical definition. Outsourcing, we are looking at somebody else or another company doing work on our behalf. Now, there are four broad classifications of information systems outsourcing, so getting somebody else to do our information systems IT work. The first is ad hoc. This is simply a short-term contract to fulfill a special need. So maybe, for example, there's been a particularly busy time of year for the business, we need some extra processing power, we can get that on an ad hoc basis, somebody else can process data for us. It could be a one-off project, the systems implementation stuff that we've been talking about, that could be outsourced as a project. It could be that some systems are outsourced entirely, not on an ad hoc but on a permanent basis, but only part of the system. So for example, management of your website or maybe your payroll systems, or maybe your debtor control systems. Those could be outsourced. Or alternatively, you have total outsourcing. All aspects of IS and IT are managed by an external organisation. Now we can choose how many people get involved in this outsourcing. We can look at multiple sourcing. There's no law that says all of our IS and IT has to be done by the same outsourcer. So you might choose somebody who's particularly skilled at one aspect, perhaps web design, to do that part. Somebody else with much more financial experience doing another part of RIS. The other alternative is an incremental approach. Rather than doing the whole lot in one go, if you like, a direct changeover, a big risk there, we might do it incrementally, stage by stage, and outsource one part, see how it goes, learn from it, and so on and so on. For large organisations, you might actually set up a new legal entity as a joint venture. I used to work for AXA, and they had effectively a separate legal entity that managed all the technology side of the business. And finally, you could simply be dealing with a service provider. This is the third party who simply provide the service over a network. So they will access your network, access your system in order to provide specific services. Things like password resetting would be a classic example of this. The next lecture example is a classic exam style requirement. It asks you to consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing IS activities. Now the objective here is to get a good balance between the two. So let's draw up a grid which has on one side the disadvantages and on the other side the advantages. Now, as I say, this is a classic exam type question, so what I'd like you to do is to get at least 2 advantages and at least 2 disadvantages. That would cover you for, say, a 4-mark requirement in the exam. Hopefully you'll be able to get a couple extra on top of that, but that should be your target to get at least 4 areas. So please press pause now and get some ideas together, and then I'll share some of my thoughts with you. Right, well, here's some suggestions that the examiner would be looking for. As far as advantages go, the big first advantage is that it's cheaper. The idea is that you are accessing economies of scale that you don't have within your organisation. So you're going to somebody specialist who's doing the same job for a large number of organisations. They get that benefit, and therefore it's more efficient. We also get access to expert knowledge. If these people are doing this outsourced IT work for a whole range of organisations, they'll have much more experience in the technicalities than somebody who's doing this with only experience of one organisation. And finally, it's a known or fixed cost. These are often contracts drawn up where you'll pay a fixed annual or monthly payment in order for the service you provide. So for budgeting and control purposes, very helpful. So those are all perfectly valid advantages. As far as disadvantages go, the biggest disadvantage is a loss of confidentiality. If you think about what people who access your IS systems can get hold of, it could range from everything from your sales figures, your profit figures, your payroll figures, your staff's bank details, all sorts of highly sensitive information that is now being accessed by people outside your organisation. There's a lack of business-specific knowledge. One of the problems here is that although these people might be very IT literate, they won't know much about your organisation itself. And of course, if somebody else is doing this job, one of the ways that the business saves money is by getting rid of the individuals within the organisation who used to do this job. Therefore, we lose internal skills. We make the positions redundant of those IT, as a result of which an outsourcing project is very difficult to reverse, simply because you no longer have the internal skills. So there we go. There's 8 factors down there. Each of those could be developed, if this was the exam, into perhaps 1 mark per issue. So potentially up to 8 marks available there. Finally, the service level agreement. This is, if you like, a contract that is drawn up between the outsourcing provider and the outsourcing customer. The idea here is to agree up front the level of service that is expected. As with any other service, you don't want to have any shocks further down the line when you think that something's part of the deal and it turns out not to be. Of course, if that is your information systems that are suffering, you could be in big trouble. So, the sorts of things that would be included in this contract are the service level itself. So, for example, if somebody phones this outsourced IT help desk, how long should it be before they get a response? Should it be answered within 3 rings, within 3 minutes, within 3 days? If there's a systems failure, how long until an engineer comes out to site? An exit route. Although you're in a contract, there's a risk that something might go horrifically wrong. You might want to pull out of this contract. Well, what are the conditions in which you as a customer can do that? Or to what extent are you tied in for the foreseeable future? Timescale. When does the contract expire? There's a tradition that says you get the best service in your outsourcing contract in the first and the last year. The first year because you're a new customer, they want to impress you. The last year because your contract's due for renewal and they don't want to lose you. But the time scale of the contract is very important. Who owns the software? This is very important because if the software is owned by the outsourcing provider, if you leave them, you lose the software. And of course it could be incredibly expensive to buy that software off them if you need it. Dependencies. Who is dependent on what for whom? So for example, we might say that we would expect, I don't know, systems failures to be resolved within 2 days if the system crashes, but there might be dependencies on the customer for that. For example, it needs to be reported. We need to give physical access to the engineer to come onto site. We might need to have to give specific information about the nature of the problem. Employment issues. Particularly the case here if you are transferring staff from your company as the customer to the outsourcing company. You often get this with very large organisations that are outsourcing, for example, ISIT. What they might say is that a member of staff used to work for your own company, company X, but now you're going to work for the outsourcer. You're effectively doing the same job. The issue here, though, is there are all sorts of employment law issues. Is your job being made redundant? Are you being re-employed somewhere else? And if you are, what does that do to your employment rights? Does it mean it's a new job or simply a transfer? So all of that has to be dealt with. Don't worry about the legalities of that. Just be aware of it as a general issue. And, of course, key to the contract is the cost involved and the payment terms. Under what situations can somebody, for example, withhold payment due to poor service? So if you get a question on service level agreement, that's a very handy list of 7 things you can record. These are things that need to be considered. So to summarise this chapter, we started off by looking at how we can use information systems for competitive advantage, and we recognised the competitive position that organisations can place themselves in. And the main differentiation here was between whether you choose to compete on cost or on quality. We then moved on to consider how we can use this competitive position to align with our business strategy. And the main issue here was using Porter's 5 forces, and this allowed us to understand